On behalf of the Jesuit School Network's Conference Office, welcome to our first virtual Ignatian inquiry session of the 2024-25 school year. As you know, the JSN seeks to be a supportive resource to our member schools, and this virtual session is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen, to learn, and to engage with one another. We're eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education, and we envision our particular brand of Ignatian inquiry to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. For those of you that I do not know, and I see so many familiar faces here, which I'm happy about, but for those that I don't yet know, I am Kristen Ross Cully, and I serve as Director of Educational Inquiry with the JSN's Conference Office. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Kristen Smith, here on the call, who leads all things communications for our team, who is here on the Zoom and will help us to enjoy a smooth afternoon together. If we can take just a moment before we begin our main presentation to start with a prayer, as we do, if we can take a moment across the network here to quiet ourselves and to be reminded that in being together, that we are in the presence of God. So in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's a prayer for kinship and community. Lord of light, who moves us forward, you call us to kinship and community. In this time of growth and greening, we pray that we may grow in our compassion and care for all our sisters and brothers, those around us at our tables, those in all parts of our local communities, those across our nation in power or in pain, those at our borders seeking safety and solace. May we be inclusive, and may our circle of care ever widen. May we practice being fully present, listening with respect and attention, especially to those at the margins. May we be moved to serve and to advocate, seeking to create a beloved community where even the faintest voice can be heard. Lord of light, we give thanks for your call to kinship and community. Re-energize our spirits so we may respond and become part of the growth and greening of the people of God, building your kingdom, healing the earth, and welcoming all your children. Saint Ignatius Loyola, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Again, I welcome you to our first virtual Ignatian inquiry session of the school year, entitled Inclusive Leadership at Jesuit Secondary Schools in the Jesuit Schools Network. This virtual session will explore the doctoral research undertaken by Dr. Katie McCann. In sharing her research across the JSN, Dr. McCann will highlight the connection between school leadership and the experience of inclusion in the workplace. Aligned with the Universal Apostolic Preferences of the Society of Jesus and rooted in Catholic social thought and Ignatian pedagogy, as well as in research on inclusive leadership. In her recently completed research values the importance of rooting DEIB work solidly in the mission and identity of our schools. And it's my pleasure to formally introduce Dr. McCann. Katie began her time in Jesuit schools as a Jesuit volunteer at Loyola High School in Tanzania from 2012 to 2014. She is currently the campus minister for Ignatian service at Xavier High School in New York City. She recently graduated from Fordham University's Graduate School of Education, where she earned her PhD in church and non-public school leadership and researched inclusive leadership in Jesuit secondary education, secondary schools for her dissertation. She lives in Westchester, New York, with her husband, Jimmy, and her son, James, who just happily started his Catholic school journey in pre-K 3 at Immaculate Heart of Mary. Katie, Dr. McCann, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for this generous invitation, if not ambitious, which is a word Kristen and I have been throwing around. So I'm going to hopefully share my slides so we can start. Okay. So as Kristen mentioned, The title of this is Inclusive Leadership at Jesuit Secondary Schools in the JSN. This is also the title of my dissertation. Who am I? Why study this? Why now? So this is a recent accomplishment for me and my family. I started this degree 5 years ago, and our worlds and my little part of it were very different when I started in September 2019. So while I was taking classes on ethical leadership and mission and mission-based leadership, the world was also facing extremely unprecedented challenges. COVID-19, the racial justice and awakening that happened in our schools and institutions were all a part of all of our lived experience, and it was also part of our conversations in our classes and in our homes. And so this was all a factor in deciding what I should study, what I cared about enough to spend all this time focusing on. And what I observed in the leaders of different Catholic schools that I was a part of and aware of at the time is that leaders were struggling, and it felt like there was a disconnect between our sense of mission and purpose and how to respond to these different racial and other injustices that became uncovered through the pandemic and the summer of 2020. And yet it felt so clear to me that in teaching Catholic social thought to my seniors that we had a reason to root our responses in our mission and identity. And so this was a question that I did feel passionate enough to spend time studying even while pregnant and having a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old eventually, right? So it was something that felt meaningful and important enough to take that time to do. I acknowledge that I'm approaching this from the perspective and social identity of a straight white woman who has been a part of the Catholic Church and Catholic education for my whole life. My parents were educators. I've gone to Catholic school since nursery school. And so while I have at times struggled with my gender and my relationship to the Catholic Church, I've chosen to stay and be a witness to a strong female presence in Catholic organizations. I've worked in co-ed Catholic schools, I've worked in all-girls Catholic schools, and now I'm currently at an all-boys traditional Jesuit high school in New York City, Xavier High School. So this is all part of where this came about, a little bit about my life and how I chose to study and pay attention to this. So one of the things I started to study in those classes was the idea of inclusive leadership. And a lot of the literature was based in the business or for-profit world, maybe some in higher education, but there wasn't a specific focus on secondary education or a Catholic secondary education setting or a specifically Ignatian secondary education setting. However, when I became a part of a school in the Jesuit Schools Network, Xavier High School, I started to realize that the JSN really was prioritizing inclusion. And this was a time that this study could align well with the purpose and the strategic plan of the JSN. In that study and in those conversations with people like Kristen and Catherine, there was also this idea that emerged about Jesuit schools as dialogue schools. So schools that are in dialogue with the world around them, that are Christian, that are Catholic, that are rooted in their mission, but also engaged with and responding to the world around us. So all of these things came together. And in case you haven't taken the time to read the strategic plan as thoroughly as I wound up doing, there are some excerpts from that 2022-2025 JSN strategic plan. So initiative 4 is what I was focusing on, right? This context of the COVID-19 pandemic, racial awakening, Indigenous truth and reconciliation efforts, forced migration, climate change, all of these realities have revealed inequities among us. And so the JSN was using this as a focus, right? One of their initiatives for the 2022-2025 strategic plan. So I found a way to root this question in documents and intentions of the JSN. And I reached out to Kristen to see how we could collaborate. In that, I noticed that there was this intent to create an Ignatian framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wondered how I might be able to contribute to that in some small way. So I've used inclusive leadership. This is an idea that I've put together a definition of based on different readings, right? Different research. I kind of put together this definition that I used in my research. And so when referring to inclusive leadership, this is what I mean. The idea that it demonstrates to all employees that their diverse identities are intrinsically good and valued by the organization. In the research, inclusive leaders have been shown to embody 6 important traits, including a visible commitment to diversity and inclusion, humility, awareness of bias, curiosity about others, cultural intelligence, and effective collaboration. And yes, much of that is from the business or for-profit world, but I think we can all easily see how these qualities are exceptionally valuable for school leaders as well. So the purpose of my research and study was to first understand better what employees' experiences were. So from a program that's studying leadership, it was important that I ground my research in the adults in the building and the leaders of the schools and understanding what qualities they had, what qualities they could develop. So understanding the employees' experiences related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. That's not to say that these are not related to students' experiences. They absolutely are, which is essential. And then to provide some recommendations, hopefully to leaders of secondary schools like yourselves who are seeking to create inclusive school cultures. I had 3 research questions. The first, are Jesuit secondary schools inclusive workplaces? If so, to what extent and for whom? What factors influence an employee's experience of inclusion in their school community? And finally, what is the nature and extent of DEIB professional development opportunities provided by the Jesuit secondary schools in the JSN? It was important that I look at what the schools in the JSN were providing, not just professional development that people had experienced, that they got in their education at some point, but what was being offered in the schools in the network. And so the literature is rooted in these 3 main bodies: Ignatian pedagogy, the research on inclusive leadership, and Catholic social thought. Here's a list of literature. Of course, my works cited and reference list is much more extensive, but these are some of the main sources that I went to in trying to understand and root this research in the literature. So the strategic plan that we discussed already, the Universal Apostolic Preferences align very well, and different Jesuit documents, right? A living tradition, and this dissertation by Dr. Jane Bleasdale that really, when I found it, I knew that I wanted to pick up on this, right? To take from her her recommendations, her ideas for further exploration, and to develop them. And so she did talk a lot about the need for leadership formation and professional development opportunities, and for DEIB to be a shared responsibility, for it not just to be siloed in one office, but that it be a shared commitment by all of the leadership. And then finally, when the JSN did publish their framework for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that became a part of my literature as well. Then in the inclusive leadership, most frequently was the Moore-Barak Climate for Inclusion Exclusion Scale, which shaped the instrument that was sent out. And then there's some other articles here that are worth reading that contributed to that definition of inclusive leadership. And finally, Catholic social thought, right? The principles of human dignity and solidarity, and the complementarity of justice and charity. So school leaders looking at their own personal biases at that level of charity and individual care, and also looking at structures and systems and where they fit into that. I looked a little bit about this connection between Catholic social thought and critical race theory, and then also critical race theory and the formation of school leaders. I looked at different authors and scholars on LGBTQ inclusion in Catholic settings. And finally, in the spring, right before my dissertation was finalized, there was this article from America Magazine that specifically talked about, in a much shorter version, what my dissertation was looking at, right? This Catholic approach to diversity, equity, inclusion in education. So I'm not going to focus too much on the specifics of the research methodology, the limitations and assumptions. If you have questions about that, I certainly welcome them. But I think what this group is most likely interested in is, what did we find, right? And what are the recommendations? But we did use a mixed methods approach. So a survey was sent out through the JSN to school leaders and leaders of DEIB. It was based on the Moore-Barak inclusion-exclusion scale, and it was adapted for an educational setting. And an additional adaptation was 3 open-ended prompts that were expertly reviewed and that opened up the respondents to deeper reflection. The unit of analysis were employees at secondary schools within the JSN. We did limit it to the 48 traditional Jesuit secondary schools in the United States, just in order to be able to draw comparisons that were in like institutions. The quantitative part had the dependent variable of overall level of inclusion in the workplace, and those were based on the survey responses that created a composite score. So there were 15 prompts. They each had a score associated with them. And then they were considered in relation to these 2 independent variables: membership in an underrepresented group and formal training in DEIB from school within the JSN, to see, is there a relationship between experiences of inclusion or exclusion and either or both your membership in an underrepresented group or the formal training that you received in DEIB. This is the overall null hypothesis that resulted in the 3 separate null hypotheses. And the qualitative piece had these 3 open-ended prompts. So they included, please describe what, if any, formal training you have received through your current school in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. 2, What, if any, connection do you see between the leadership of your school and your personal experience of inclusion or exclusion in your workplace? And 3, finally, if you're willing, please share a short personal anecdote or reflection of your experience of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in your workplace. And we had 119 respondents, which in the scheme of things is not that many, but for dissertation research, it certainly provided enough for me to look at, to study, to investigate, and to try to understand. While the quantitative piece did not prove to be statistically significant, the survey did elicit really rich qualitative narratives from the respondents that allowed for a deeper look into their experiences of DEIB in their school. And of those 119 respondents, the scores ranged from 28 on the lower end to 90 on the higher end. The average score was 66.14, and the possible range overall was 15 to 90. And the higher scores indicated a higher sense of inclusion in their workplace. These are some of the demographics of the people who responded. So there was a question about their role at the school. For all of these questions, people had the option to not respond in order to preserve anonymity and a sense of confidentiality. These were not forced responses. So people could choose not to respond, and 23 people chose not to respond. The purpose was to make sure nobody felt like you could easily identify who they were based on their responses in the demographics section, so that they could answer honestly and freely without feeling like they were easily identifiable. So I'll mention this in some of the recommendations, but we had 21 responses from administration, 56 from faculty, 10 from support staff, 9 who identified as other. They explicitly identified themselves as a Jesuit, a counselor, somebody on the leadership team, or director, which I didn't give as an option. I think, this is a nice distribution over here, the years at their current school. Again, 23 chose not to respond, 28, 0 to 5, 19, 6 to 10, 16 in the 11 to 15 range, and 12 in the 16 to 20, and then 21 in the 21 plus. So that I think is somewhat nicely distributed. The part that is definitely a limitation is that these numbers over here do not reflect the numbers here. So these are numbers from the JSN's annual report that I went through and, added together from the different regions and provinces that were part of this study. And so there were 430 in the administration. These ratios don't exactly line up, right? 21 administrators responded. There's 430 administrators in this body. And so I'll look a little bit more at that, but really a big one is the fact that there's 2,400 staff and only 10 support staff were able or did respond. And so that's something to consider for the future. These are the average composite inclusion exclusion scores based on the responses to the independent variable, so membership in an underrepresented group or DEIB training. And you can certainly extrapolate from these, but I'm careful not to make definitive conclusions, because when we look at the statistical significance in my next slide, we're not quite able to draw those conclusions. So while yes, people who were not from an underrepresented group and did not receive DEIB training did have a lower score than people who did receive DEIB training and were not from an underrepresented group, it's still not certain that the connection is clear. So I don't want to make something seem like it's something that I can't truly prove. So here you'll see the interaction or relationship that was closest to statistically significant was people who participated in some kind of formal DEIB training from their schools. And so that was at 0.051, and the p-value that we want is 0.05. So that was the closest one, and maybe there's something to investigate there. Maybe I need to choose different variables for the next one. But the qualitative responses were excellent. And so in the 3 open-ended prompts that came after this, the quantitative part of this survey, 94 respondents out of that 119 chose to share a description of the DEIB training that they received. 84 chose to share about the connection they perceive between DEIB and leadership of their school, and 53 shared really thoughtful and personal experiences of their experience of DEIB in their schools. And so this is what we can look at together. I then coded those responses and came up with these codes based on patterns that emerged. In addition to these codes, I do want to highlight some themes. So while, yes, the codes may be clear, right? If somebody said they didn't receive any DEIB training, that's pretty obvious. For the themes that emerged, though, many described some kind of surface level or inconsistent attempt at DEIB training. The phrase checking a box was used. And then respondents also often connected this lack of prioritization of the DEIB training to a lack of focus or emphasis on the DEIB director or office as well, and noted issues of retention in those offices. Some schools gave examples of really consistent quarterly trainings. Some gave examples of participation in courageous conversations. Some really did seem to have formal training of depth and consistency, where it felt like to the participants, the school was prioritizing this. But that was 19 out of the 94. And so that indicates that in this piece here, the no formal, the little formal, or some formal, something is off, right? Something is being done, but is it enough? Is it rooted enough in our values? Is it sticking? And here are some quotes. Obviously, there were many quotes, but here are a few that just kind of highlight some of those ideas. And so the respondents are making these connections, right? They see that this prioritization or lack of prioritization of the formal training from their school is connected to other pieces of the puzzle. The second prompt, the connection between leadership of the school and personal experiences of inclusion or exclusion, actually is positive, right? I think that this gives us hope that the role a leader can have is tremendous. And when there's a positive connection, it's strong. They see leaders as culture setters who are able to promote the values of DEIB and support those who are working on it. However, even the positive descriptions did call on their schools and their school leaders to deepen and strengthen the commitment. And we do need to pay attention to the negative connection and the mixed connection, because in those responses, there were examples of leadership's resistance to DEIB, a misunderstanding between the leadership and the person responding, a disconnect. And so these are all pieces that we still need to pay attention to, right? It does show that there's promise and responsibility and potential, but we also need to be aware of the places where there was a negative connection between the leadership and the employee's experience. So this was a positive one. Our leadership does not shy away from issues of DEI. Since I have been here, it has gotten much more deliberate. Lots of work still needs to be done. On the other hand, my leadership is not interested. They say they are, but as one of only 3 Black staff members, I can tell you they are not. From my perspective and my work with the leadership to be more social justice oriented, DEIB is not seen as important. So we need to pay attention to all of these. An interesting piece that came up that I should have anticipated, but was still a reminder to me that I have to keep track of my own biases. We are an all-boys school, and I think my identity as a woman is more salient than my identity as a person of color here. While I am fairly high up in leadership, I suspect that further career options here may be limited by my gender. Gender came up in response to each of the 3 qualitative prompts. And finally, the third prompt, if you are willing, please share a short personal anecdote or reflection. And these were mixed, definitely. There were a few positive, 11 positive experiences shared that described experiences of inclusion, agency, and belonging. But there were also experiences of othering, microaggressions, and exclusion. And those were difficult to read and yet extremely important to pay attention to, especially if we think about the role of cura personalis in Jesuit schools, right? If faculty members are feeling and experiencing these things, they're something leadership needs to pay attention to. There was also a discussion of limiting hiring practices and issues with retention and promotion of employees. Here are some of those. I think many of the times that I feel excluded as opposed to included has more to do with either my gender or the fact that I am the DEI director and therefore siloed in my programs. I have to ask to be included and explain why I should be included. And then this reflection also sheds light on some of the differences in demographics, right? Our faculty is 92% white, while our student population is only 70% white. It is difficult to be one of a small handful of BIPOC educators on campus, and I feel for our BIPOC and LGBTQ students who have repeatedly voiced experiences of not feeling understood, included, or like they belong on campus. Students have called for greater representation in curriculum and faculty accountability in instances of racism and bias, and more student support. Progress is being made, but the pace is slow. So this research is a starting point, right? And that's not to say that there wasn't research before, but these findings are another point for further reflection, prayer, and action. This is an opportunity, right, for me to share these findings in this forum with all of you present. It was work that I've tried to pick up on from the findings that Dr. Jane Bleasdale wrote, and then certainly research from Kristen and Maura Toom-Estevez on women's role in leadership in the JSN was all relevant to understanding these findings. So clearly there is still serious work to do. The schools in the JSN, the demographics are shifting And so these experiences are not likely to stop happening. Experiences of othering, exclusion, and microaggressions all still exist, and we need to honestly confront these realities. What I'm suggesting based on rooting these findings in literature is this idea of vision-driven justice. And vision-driven justice is defined as a paradigm shift that requires you to enter into a deep, honest assessment of who you are, where you are, and what you are up against as you fight toward who you need to become. And we're not unused to this idea, right? This is a process adjacent to the Ignatian paradigm of experience, reflection, and action. Finally, in working towards a kind of mission-driven justice, we need access to more meaningful professional development opportunities that are rooted in Catholic and Jesuit mission and identity, instead of those that may, while well-meaning, perpetuate the dysfunctional cycle of equity work. And this is the dysfunctional cycle of equity work. It's an idea from Cobb and Crownapple, and it looks at this cycle. There's a catalyst, something happens, there's a public commitment to equity, and then there's some kind of challenge, we lose momentum, and then there's just this acceptance of the status quo. I offer this Ignatian paradigm again as a counter to the dysfunctional cycle of equity work. We have tools and resources to ground this work in our mission and identity. Similarly, this is from the vision-driven justice idea. Before you can go into social justice work, before you trip yourself up with an ego-driven approach to justice that is rooted in a white savior complex or an internalized inferiority complex that low-key reiterates white supremacy, you have to be honest about your private and personal stuff, your stuff as it interacts with your social identities, and map those out, right? And so while we might have good intentions, leaders might have good intentions, but if the approach is not working, we need to reevaluate, and we have tools available to us to do this. So my argument is that we have to root our DEIB work in something like a mission-driven justice, to root it in Catholic social teaching, in the idea of dialogue schools, and to encourage and empower leaders to do this in some kind of intentional formation process. A note about belonging, right? I focus on inclusion. Belonging is essential, and the JSN recognized this and included belonging in the Ignatian framework. Belonging is an essential psychological longing that we all have, and so including that intentionally in our language around DEI is great, and I added more literature on belonging. So I recognize that belonging is the future, even though I was studying inclusion. And finally, some recommendations based on these findings. So certainly there could be further widespread studies of school cultures, perhaps different independent variables, some kind of look at gender or alumni status. Many people shared that their identity as an alum of the school made them feel included. So maybe there's something more to look at there. Trying to understand in greater detail the experience of women in leadership in our traditional Jesuit secondary schools. I mentioned this earlier, but this survey clearly did not reach all employees. The staff was underrepresented significantly. So how could we reach a larger audience to include their voices and experiences? And those qualitative responses did indicate experiences of othering, microaggression, and exclusion that as Jesuit schools, we need to pay attention to and rectify and work to create cultures of belonging and understanding. Here are some things that might be reading of interest if you haven't looked at them already. I mentioned one article from America over the summer after my dissertation was totally done. This article was published, and it certainly touches on all of these ideas in a much shorter fashion than my dissertation. And it is a response to the article I mentioned earlier, A Catholic Alternative to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Education. This was the book that actually somebody had recommended from, I think it was like DEIB leaders coffee in the fall of last year. And from that book, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, I also read from those ideas on vision-driven justice from Black Appetite, White Food. So perhaps reading ideas for anyone interested in this. And finally, thank you. Thank you to the JSN for supporting this work. Thank you to anyone who is still here and still paying attention. And thank you to the leaders, right? It's not easy work, but it is important and essential work. Thank you to everyone who responded to my survey and shared vulnerably and honestly their experiences. And thank you to everyone who has supported this work. Here are my references.
Thank you so much, Katie. Oh, am I on mute here? Okay. Thank you so much, Katie. You know, I can't help but think, I think it was just about a year ago where you sent your survey out. It was this time of year, right? So it's remarkable to think back to that and to how far you've come. So thanks for all the energy and the time that goes into sharing this kind of presentation. We have some time now for insights and feedback and reaction from those on the call, which we're most interested in, those of you that are doing this work. Before we do that, I would just say, Katie, that I appreciated very much the way you started out telling your own story and your own interest in why you chose to pay attention to that. I like that language, choosing to pay attention to this. And I think, I probably speak for everyone saying I admire any full-time professional who engages in this kind of scholarly research and the commitment to having it not just sit on a shelf, but sharing it widely amongst other educators. It's really terrific. I will kick off the question and answer period with one point of clarification that I was interested in. I think it was in your prompt 3, the categories that you had of inclusion, agency, and belonging, and then othering, microaggressions, and exclusions. Were they your own categories, or were they what emerged from the data, or is that drawn from literature?
Those emerged from the responses. In my dissertation, I also have definitions of all of those terms that directly correspond with those responses and examples. Obviously, there are even more quotes that I could draw on. I tried to choose a few for the presentation. Let me see if I can quickly give you some definitions that I used for those. Here we go. So for othering is an experience that extends beyond individual prejudices and behaviors. Othering represents interpersonal, institutional, and structure processes that violate dignity. Othering encompasses systems such as racism, Islamophobia, and heterosexism. Cobb and Cranapple identify 4 indicators of othering, which are 4 states of being that describe the quality of people's present experience that can be used to gauge and assess the degree to which dignity is violated. They include otherized, dismissed, marginalized, and mistreated. The term othering represents processes that distort dignity, transforming equal human worth into an us versus them hierarchy of stratified, unequal human worth and value. A microaggression, as defined by the American Psychological Association, is commonly occurring brief verbal or nonverbal behavioral and environmental indignities that communicate derogatory attitudes or notions toward a different other. Microaggressions may be intentional or unintentional, and the perpetrators may possibly be unaware of their behavior. And then I don't have a definition in the terms for exclusion, but examples that were opposite of inclusion.
Thank you. Thank
Sure.
you. I open it up now, and please feel free just to chime in and share your questions, insights, reactions with Katie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, my camera's off today. Question not only for you, Katie, but for the group as well. Have you seen this work shift at all, given the fact that we are in October of a political year? Have you seen that change not only in your school, but do you see that shifting in general as we are in this political cycle?
Well, I finished my dissertation and graduated in August, so I'm done with this work now, right? That was not really part of the narrative when this survey was sent out, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not part of people's experiences here who can shine light on that now. I know that we have had conversations about how to approach conversations rooted in our faith, right? Rooted in those principles of human dignity and respect for the person in front of you. But I'm not sure that I can speak to trends across institutions.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Katie. Thanks so much. It's great to see you on here. I'm driving home, so my camera's off. And I asked this knowing that you didn't get a wide range of responses like you had expected, but did you happen to notice any like regional trends? Again, knowing that you gave people the option to not say where they were from, but did you notice anything for those that did?
I didn't collect any response that would give me a sense of what region they were from. The thought there was really to preserve as much as possible the anonymity of the respondents. So I can't answer that, unfortunately, because I can't think of a response that did share like what region they were from. So sorry that I can't answer that better, Kelly.
No, all good. Thanks, Katie.
Hi, Katie. I'm Lorraine Shepard. I'm the former principal at Sacred Heart Nativity. Thanks for sharing your research. Really, really good stuff there. I was really struck by the piece in terms of in your recommendations about other variables, because I've always been struck with when in many of our institutions, you've got multi-generationals, a workforce, right? In some places, perhaps 4 different generations. And how do those things affect DEIB and their inclusion and their belonging? So you've got my mind going a lot more, and there's so many of those variables out there that affect all of this. So I just, wanted to thank you for that, for sharing your research with us.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, for the purposes of the dissertation, I had to choose just 2 to focus on. But right, I think that could be picked up, right? So these ideas didn't exactly turn out the way I expected they might have a relationship. What else might?
Hi, Katie. Is anybody else going? My name's Tim Grady. I'm at Walsh Jesuit High School in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. And first I want to thank you for the work you did on this. It's some of it's hard to see, and others it's, I'm, not surprised, I guess. And the other things that I guess I want to get at or ask you is that we've taken on some work at Walsh Jesuit around this, and it seems to me that at the board level, you know, this idea of entering into some of the key readings we've seen from the Jesuits and from the network around the challenge to ask ourselves how we can, as Jesuit schools, be radically inclusive of everyone. And at the board level, we had a committee of Ignatian identity and a committee of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we've taken on the disruptive work of asking those two committees to try to integrate into one, with the objective being that equity, inclusion, and belonging is central to our Jesuit identity. And it has been disruptive. Just the idea of it has caused anxiety and folks saying, are you diminishing one or the other through this call? And so I can appreciate even the comment we just heard about like the legacy of schools and the way that folks view, oh, here's my faith in the Ignatian component over here, and here's equity and inclusion over here. And to disrupt that mindset with intention is something we're trying to do. So my question is there a version of what you shared today that you might be able to make available for schools who are wrestling with some of this to point out, like, this data demonstrates to us that this is an opportunity for all our Jesuit schools that we're wrestling with. So maybe that's like a executive summary or something like that. And secondly, are there readings or things you would suggest in your work that offer a framework for schools, or something that we can share with our groups, our individuals who are wrestling with this here? Because I think if we can demonstrate at the board level and then senior leadership that real intentional work is happening here, it might allow us some other avenues across the school to show that this isn't a box that's being checked. This is intentionally disruptive because we want to really get to that countercultural reality of Jesuit education. So I'll stop there, but I'm curious, is there something we could share with some of our group? And do you have any suggestions around things that we can potentially be reading or encouraging others to sit with so that they can kind of get a better framework for what we're trying to get done?
Thank you. And this is exactly why I studied this, right? So certainly those two America articles are good reading if you haven't read them already. I think this presentation is recorded, so that'll be a resource. If there's a shorter thing I can put together for you as a resource, I'd be happy to. And the JSN's framework for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is solidly rooted in scripture, in Catholic social thought, and it does give that framing, right? That these are not separate and distinct, that they are together. They need to be in relationship with each other if they haven't been already. And I guess I just want to support and encourage that decision, right? To make those two committees work together. I think that that's what needs to happen. So those are a few resources. I don't know if Kristen has another example of a framework that could be useful in this.
No, I think you said it, Tim. I really appreciate that question. It's actually one of the reasons why we thought it was important to start this inquiry series this year with Katie's research, because we will record this session, and we often find that these recordings are good conversation sparks in departments or faculties, you know, just like this, for folks that can't be here today to watch the recorded version. And in this case, to have it really be rooted in scholarship from one of our colleagues, you know, across the country is even more special. So I hope that perhaps might be a starting point. And then I can connect you both as well after this, if that's helpful. I want to be mindful of time. I know that there's so much more to say and more to share. And again, that's what we're hoping for with Katie's work here. It is a terrific, as you said, it's not the first, but it is certainly a great stepping stone for the important and challenging and oftentimes complicated work that lies ahead. So thank you to so many of us, or so many of you who have joined us here. It's a delight, really, on a Tuesday afternoon in October to get together with friends and colleagues around the network and dig into something of importance in one way or another to all of our work. So thank you for making the time to be here. The recording should be available within a couple of days, so we'll promote that around our various social media platforms. I'll make sure that you all get a copy of it as well. Please share it. It's one of the best ways that we know to get word out. And a special thanks to Dr. McCann for all of the time and energy that went into this. Again, to step back and think for a moment that a full-time professional undertakes this kind of important work. It's our duty, all of ours, to continue to share it. So thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. We really appreciate your time.